Do you remember on the first day of class when I asked you, are we freer today in the early 21st century than when we first began our History 1302 class in 1877? Has freedom expanded? Has freedom been placed into more hands, more American hands? Have we gotten better at providing freedom, equality, and opportunity to more and more Americans? On the first day of class, many of you answer that question yes. Women could vote, you say. Racial and ethnic minorities that were once upon a time barred from our classroom, that would not be permitted to sit in our classroom, are now sitting in our classroom. We've got a pluralistic society, and include culture in on that. We're far more tolerant of various kinds of American culture, or culture that comes from outside the United States for that matter. Others of you, although many of you of this persuasion happen to be in the minority, said that freedom had actually contracted. There were things that came about over the 20th century, especially in the early part of the 21st century, that served to shrink freedom and equality. You pointed to things like government surveillance, monitoring American behavior, looking for shadowy men lurking in the background of American life, waiting to do us harm, terrorists, enemies of the state. And because the government was so preoccupied in searching out these people, we all took a hit when it comes to civil liberties and what we have as our rights as American citizens. The essence of the final exam essay section, the long essay, I mean, is to determine for yourself whether freedom has expanded or contracted. Now, there's one thing that I'd like to make clear before I move any further. I really don't care how you answer the question. I think that you can make a real compelling case for either way. What I really do want to press upon you is you need to explain to me why you think what you think. So in essays like these, and you've written several essays for me by now, you need to spell out your argument very, very clearly in the introduction. I think that freedom and equality has expanded because I think freedom and equality has contracted or has been limited because, okay? And then you need to go into, I would say, at least three pieces of evidence that verify or support your position, okay? Now, as I mentioned, you could make a case one way or another, or if you really want to be wishy-washy, you can say it's expanded, but in other ways it's contracted. You're going to have to be careful with that because it might not make so much sense to your reader. But anyway, let's start out with the idea that freedom and equality has expanded. As I'd mentioned before, when this class began, there were Jim Crow laws, not just affecting African Americans, but most people of color. Jim Crow laws in places like San Francisco, where the Chinese immigrants were not allowed to live virtually anywhere outside of Chinatown. Jim Crow laws in the Southwest that made Mexican Americans and other people, transplants from Latin America, second-class citizens. And then, of course, you've got your Jim Crow laws virtually in any part of the United States, what makes African Americans second, or in some instances, third-class citizens. Okay? Over the course of the 20th century, many of those nasty things involving institutionalized racism, systemic racism, many of those things have at the very least been addressed. For instance, in 1964, Lyndon Johnson gives us the Civil Rights Act. And as you should know by now, what this does is it bars discrimination in public amenities. And so the signs that say whites only, they come down from above the drinking fountains. And institutions of higher learning are forced to integrate. Um, you can no longer take race, creed, color, or national origin into account when it comes to whether you're going to hire somebody. It's the best man for the job. So in a lot of ways, this was Martin Luther King's dream, that his children would be judged based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Okay. A year later, we see the Voting Rights Act, and what this does is it enforces voting laws, and it enfranchises. It puts a vote in more people's hands, and I don't just mean women. I mean people of color who had been specifically targeted to have their votes taken away from them in various forms and fashions. So the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, all of these laws are serving to expand freedom, expand equality, at least equality before the law. In ways involving class, I think that you could make the case that freedom expanded at least in the middle part or by the middle part of the 20th century. When we first began this class, unions, for all intents and purposes, were illegal organizations. And then in 1935, Congress issues the Wagner Act, and what you see is, for the first time in American history, workers have the right, the constitutional right, to go out there and form unions, and their employers are forced to bargain with them. Okay? And so from 1932 until when unionism really peaks in the United States in the early 1950s, you see two things. You see a rapid growth of union membership, and you also see a very considerable growth of the American middle class, what you and I would consider to be the middle class. Um, you see industrial workers, auto workers, steel workers, truck drivers that are not only able to participate in what we would consider mainstream middle class life, buying their house, owning a couple cars, potentially even sending their children to college so that the next generation could have it better than the current generation. They actually had quite a bit of say in their day-to-day working life. Um, Again, one of the things that the Wagner Act provided was not just union representation, but an actual voice on the factory floor, that you could tell your boss that it was time for your break without living in fear that you were going to lose your job. And so the Wagner Act is a good example of an expansion of freedom, in the sense that it puts more freedom and equality in the hands of people that were clearly not equals in the political sense when this class began in 1877, and that would be workers. Women. Women get the right to vote in 1920. Women are entering into the paid workforce in greater and greater numbers. You see the ebb and flow of the feminist movement throughout the course of the 20th century, and certainly into the 21st century. And so in that respect, freedom is expanding for women, although you could also make the case that it peaks and valleys. In some instances, it's a step forward, and then you'll see other instances that people are taking a step back. But over the course of time, I think if you focus on those three issues, you focus on race, you focus on class, and you focus on gender, you can clearly make the case that freedom has expanded. There was no 19th Amendment when the class began in 1877, so women didn't have the right to vote. Um, there was no Civil Rights Act in 1877, so we were looking at everything from segregated restrooms to segregated hotels. Um, so that's clearly one way that you can go down. Now, again, I'm giving you the bare bones example. I'm certainly willing to bet that you can come up with other forms of evidence that would buttress the case for this. Now, what I would like to do is talk a little bit about ways that you could say that freedom has contracted. Um, One thing that you can point to when it comes to the contraction of freedom is really going to be some of the things that kind of make their presence felt toward the end of the 20th century, the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Um, so let's start out again um, with our example of race, class, and gender. What you can see when it comes to the contraction of freedom is women, although they have made clear strides to civil and social equality, are really going to see a backslide of this movement as the 1980s emerges. We remember that one of the things that quote unquote radical feminism really awoke was the religious right. And when the religious right becomes a very important voting bloc of the conservative movement, one of the things that they begin to take on are some of the things that are coming out of Washington. Some of these laws are coming out of Washington, including the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, those of you that remember, the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, never was passed. And had it passed, what it would have done was made woman man's equal, at least in the eyes of the law. And so clearly that's one example of the march to freedom that is really shrunk, really limited. Okay. Other forms of social equality that is limited. Let's take a look at the 1990s. In the 1980s, homosexuals had organized themselves as a political minority, had begun to lobby for their rights. We talked a little bit about the Stonewall riots in 1969, talked a little more about activists like Harvey Milk that was pushing for rights for same-sex couples and homosexuals generally speaking. In the early 1990s, President Bill Clinton makes a step forward, or takes a step forward when it comes to delivering social equality for people of the LGBT community when he passes something called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Okay. Now, keep in mind, this was a military policy that emphasized if you were homosexual, you were supposed to keep that information to yourself in the military, and if you were a commanding officer, you were not supposed to seek out that information. Now, it's not exactly what the LGBT community wanted, in the sense that you could serve openly and it didn't matter who knew what they knew, but it really was a step forward from that old archaic policy that dated back as far as World War II, where you've got the American military that's actually screening out homosexuals. Now, countering this Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy would be the Republican-controlled Congress in the 1990s that issued the Defense of Marriage Act, DOMA. Now, what DOMA does is it describes marriage as an institution between one man and one woman. So as far as the federal government is concerned, same-sex couples cannot get married. Here's the issue with that. If you've got two people of the same sex, and they were both born in this country, let's make it a really easy analogy, what that makes those two people are citizens. And what the institution of marriage is, and I've talked about this from various times, or at various times in the course, what marriage essentially is a contract between two people. I know that's not very romantic, but essentially what a marriage license is a contract between two people, and when your maid of honor signs that contract, she's signing it as a witness. And when the minister that's performing the ceremony signs it, he's signing it as an official of the state. And of course, I'm going to guess that many of you know that if you wanted to forego all the the flowers and the chapels and the tuxedos and the so on and so forth, you could just go right down to the courthouse and you can have a justice of the peace go ahead and marry you. Okay? So by doing this, by passing the Defense of Marriage Act, it's essentially saying that two citizens of the United States that happen to be the same sex do not have access to the protection that the institution of marriage offers. Now, there's a lot of different issues that we can get into to this end. Don't really have a lot of time to talk about them, but think about something as simple as healthcare insurance, right? For those of you that file your taxes, you'll know that the provider, meaning the wage earner, that is either purchasing or qualifies for health insurance, will list each and every individual that is on his plan as a dependent for their taxes. And so what this means for same-sex couples is if you're the guy that's bringing home the bacon, your health benefits will not extend to your partner. So the Defense of Marriage Act is, in a lot of ways, an expansion of government in the sense that you've got the government saying, this group of people, it's okay for them to get married, but this group of people, it's not okay. Okay. The last thing that I think that you could really make a good case for freedom contracting would be our war on terrorism. Okay, I think this is a really obvious thing that you can kind of point to when it comes to freedom limited, especially in the early 20th century. After 9/11, we were vulnerable in a number of different ways, including psychologically. And when the powers that be said that we needed to have enhanced ways of monitoring the behavior of potential enemies of the United States, many Americans went ahead and went along with this. And probably the most important example that we can point to would be the Patriot Act that is passed in the aftermath of 9/11. And so what the Patriot Act does is grants the federal government sweeping powers when it comes to monitoring the behavior of American citizens. Now, on the surface level, the government is telling people the reason that we're doing this is simply so that we can root out people that could be potential terrorists. I don't think that you'd have a whole lot of argument, even from the most avid supporters of civil rights and civil liberties, if we didn't now know what we know that the government was doing. In 2000, early 2014, a man by the name of Edward Snowden released a series of documents to the press that illuminated the idea that it wasn't just scary people that the government was keeping their eye on. It wasn't just people that were suspected of being terrorists. It was generally the American population. It was sweeping monitoring programs that were that were clearly infringing upon civil rights and civil liberties that had really been opened up through that can of worms that was the Patriot Act in the early part of the 21st century. And so this war on terror, the Patriot Act, and the government snooping programs that we now know about because of individuals like Snowden really lend themselves to the idea that in ways that we do have more freedom, but our lives are still very much controlled by the government in a lot of different ways. Again, I really don't care which road you choose to go down when it comes to your response. I just need to see tangible pieces of evidence located throughout your essay. And so to that end, what I would do if I were you is I would choose at least three, I'll read more, but at least three strong pieces of evidence that will really support your position. If you've been paying attention, you will note that that's exactly what I did through this discussion. And so what I'd like to do now is just let you know that if you have any individual questions, I'd be happy to answer them at any time. At the same time, I'd like to wish you all good luck. It really has been a pleasure working with you this semester, and if there is anything else that I can do for you when it comes to your career here or beyond, please don't be a stranger. Please don't hesitate to let me know. Thank you and good luck.